Today you're going to church. And no, not the spooky boring kind. I'm talking about D&D gods. Building a D&D Pantheon from scratch can be a daunting and overwhelming task. So I've painstakingly developed a system for creating amazing D&D deities for your homebrew games. I'm going to walk you through all 6 steps, plus there's a free PDF template in the description that you can grab for when you create your very own Pantheon. I'm TheAlpineDM. Let's get to it. So real quick, what even is a pantheon? It's basically a fancy word that just means all of the gods, and you can think of it in terms of a culture's beliefs about which gods exist. So for example, Zeus and Poseidon are in the Greek pantheon, while Ra and Osiris are in the Egyptian pantheon. But anyway, step 1 is just to figure out how many gods you'll have in your pantheon. In the Forgotten Realms, there are dozens and dozens of gods, and if you're anything like me, that is way too many to remember, keep track of, or let alone care about. So that's why I recommend you start with just 5 gods. It's enough where your world is going to feel full, but not too many where you will be just completely overwhelmed. Plus, if you want, you can always add more if you're feeling just super ambitious. But in the example I'll be showing you, plus in the template, we are just going to stick with 5 gods. So for right now, we'll label them A through E. That is going to bring us to step 2, which is probably my favorite, and that is figuring out what your gods embody and represent. Oftentimes, gods are used as explanations for otherwise inexplicable natural phenomenon. An erupting volcano might represent a fire god's wrath, while howling wind and storms could be a goddess mourning the loss of a child. You can be as creative as you want here, but here's 5 different ways that you can come up with what gods embody and represent. First, you can make use of opposites like life and death, fire versus ice, the sun and the moon. This can be pretty much anything you want as long as it has a clear polar opposite. Take one aspect, like fire, give it to god A, and take the opposite aspect, ice, give it to god B. You get the idea, it's actually pretty straightforward. Another option is to make use of the different schools of magic. Now in D&D there are 8 schools of magic, which is not the same number as 5, how many gods we have, but you can kind of pick and choose and just have fun with it. Use some of them, don't use the others. It doesn't matter, it's all made up. Another method is to use geographic features or regions, and these might actually end up as opposites like desert and ocean, but it certainly doesn't have to. You could have a river god or a god of the forests, that sort of situation. Real quick, thanks for watching the video. If you're enjoying it, please subscribe. It really helps me pursue my dream of being a writer full-time, and it helps promote the video to other people who are going to get value out of it. That's all. The 4th way is to associate your gods with different labors or jobs. Villagers might pray to a god of blacksmithing before forging a very important sword, or when all the crops wither and die, it's because a god of the harvest was displeased with the most recent offerings. The final method, and then I promise I'm gonna take you to step 3, is to base them off of monsters. So these gods might not be worshipped on a very large scale, but they could lend strength and inspiration to different monsters of the realms. So you could have a god of the kobolds or a god of trolls. Alright, put all that together because it is your turn now. For my pantheon, I used a mixture of all of these methods, and I also assigned a couple different ones to every single god, and I would highly recommend that you do the same. So real quick, I'm going to go through my pantheon and what I put for each of my 5 gods, but leave a comment. Tell me what you put for yours. So god A is the god of blacksmithing, volcanoes, and orcs. God B is the god of rivers, fishing, and the moon. God C is the god of sun, order, and machinery. God D is the god of thievery, chaos, and illusion magic. And God E is the god of forests, music, and restoration magic. As you can see, even doing just this step adds so much depth to your pantheon, and it gives you a glimpse at these gods and who their worshippers might be. And of course, you can extrapolate these into different traits. So God A, blacksmithing, volcanoes, and orcs, immediately makes me think loud, strong, explosive. Whereas God E, forests, music, and restoration, makes me think tranquil and pure. Alright, moving on, step 3 is naming your gods, which I find to be one of the more intimidating steps. Honestly, naming anything in D&D can feel impossible. I would stare at a blank screen for so many minutes. And when I finally did come up with something, I'd be like, oh no, like that sounds stupid, or that's not very realistic. But now I have a few different methods that I'm going to show you, and these are fantastic because they can be used to name anything. They do not apply just to gods. Method 1 is to use backwards words. So what you can do is take a word that relates to one of the aspects of your god from the previous step, and then you're just going to flip it in reverse. Obviously this isn't going to work for every single word because of phonetics and spelling and stuff, but you can play around with the spelling and some of the letters to change it if you need to make it flow a little bit better. Okay, so here's 2 examples. Let's say we have a god who reigns supreme over a tropical region of islands that is filled with wondrous fruits and vegetation. The most prominent of these fruits is mangoes. So mango backwards is Ognum. Ta-da! I don't know about you, but I think Ognum sounds like a pretty cool name for a god. How dare ye question the great and mighty Ognum? Dagger. So now we're going to use the same exact method to name a lesser god of brewing mead. So mead comes from honey. Honey could be described as having an amber color. Amber backwards is Rebma. But honestly, I kind of hate that name, so I'm going to make a few tweaks just to show you how it can work. So I'm going to take the B and change it to a TH, and I'm going to add an R on the end of it to make Rethmar, which I'm way more happy with than Rebma. There's no real strategy for making these tweaks, just kind of switch out words and sounds, add prefixes, suffixes, until you get something that just feels good. Another method for naming the gods in your pantheon begins by choosing a short phrase. And this can be anything really. It could be related to an aspect of the god, it could be a song lyric, or just a sentence that you said. So what you're gonna do is take that phrase and say it over and over and over again, back to back, and kind of squish it all together. And as you're saying it, or you can also write this out on paper, I find that helps as well, is to try to pick out different combinations of sounds that could be words. And just like before, you might need to mess around with some of the spelling after you pick something, but that's like the next step. So my example phrase is, I hope it doesn't rain today, which has nothing to do with any of my gods and is just a sentence that I said. So here's what it looks like. I hope it doesn't rain today. I hope it doesn't rain today. I hope it doesn't rain today. So as you can see, you might look a little bit crazy, but just trust me, it's worth it to have a cool name for your god. To me, one of the sounds that stuck out was Sintrain, as in doesn't rain. Sintrain. And I think spelling it exactly how it sounds, like Sintrain, as in like Blasphemy Express, I think that's a little bit silly. So in this case, I would change around the spelling a little bit. I'm going to add a Y, an A, and an E just to make it have that kind of mystical, whimsy, fae sort of feeling to it. The final trick you can use to name your gods is to use foreign languages. Just fire up Google Translator, pick a random language. The less you know that language, like the less common it is spoken in your country, I think the better. And type in one of the aspects of a god that you're naming, or if you want, you can just put in a random word. But for this, I like to at least keep it a little bit related. So for me, God B is in charge of fishing. And with just a few clicks, I got the options Visvang, Calastus, and Aranza. I think these are all really cool, but I'm gonna go with Visvang just because it's the one I like the most. So now when you are naming the gods in your pantheon, I would recommend you use a combination of all 3 of these methods, mix and match them, just play around with the words and the letters until you get something that you're happy with. So here's what I got for mine. Chiguvas is the god of blacksmithing, orcs, and volcanoes. Visvang, goddess of the moon, rivers, and fishing. Aniko, god of the sun, order, and machinery. Skelm, goddess of thievery, chaos, and illusion magic. And Sintrain, god of the forests, restoration magic, and music. Next up, step 4 is to figure out the relationships that mortals have with your gods. This step is a little bit less formulaic than the last couple of steps because this can vary widely based on the world that you're trying to build. So what I'm gonna do is ask some thought-provoking questions and discuss them a little bit to prompt you so you can think about how you want your mortals to have a relationship with your gods. So grab some pen and paper, pause the video if you need to, but here we go. So the first question is, do mortals even have contact with the gods? In some pantheons, it might be completely unheard of to speak with a god, and if you went around telling people that, you might get looked at like you are an absolute lunatic. Whereas in other pantheons, it could be very normal for gods to mingle with the mortals, whether they're just overseeing and protecting their domain or actively intervening in some divine, godly type of way. If your gods do interact with mortals, then you need to figure out how often does this happen and in what form. Can the god be contacted with prayer and worship by just anybody, or does this only happen in very special occasions like rituals or full moons, or requires a sacrifice offering, that sort of thing? Most often gods are portrayed as humanoid in form, and this is definitely the most straightforward and easy way for your mortals to have a relationship with the gods. They might have a very specific iconic look, so when somebody sees them, they're just like, oh my god, there goes Thor. Or the gods might choose to take a very unassuming form and blend in. They could be a random beggar on the streets or a traveling merchant in disguise. Something I like to do is give them a special animal form, such as a rainbow-colored fox or a elk with glass antlers, and when people see these, they know that they're interacting with the divine in some way or another. Another big question you can ask is, what symbols do people use to represent these gods? This can be super simplistic, like the cross is literally just 2 lines, and that's used pretty widely. Or of course it could be something a little more detailed. Ideally, you want to use something connected to one of your god's aspects so that this symbol actually does represent them and isn't just a random tack on imagery that you put in at the end. So for example, 3 curved lines in a circle could be the symbol of Visvang, goddess of the moon and rivers. The final question in this part is, how are the gods worshipped? Or your gods might not even be worshipped at all. They could be so feared that even just uttering their name is absolutely forbidden, taboo, let alone worshiping them. If people do worship the gods, do they have a dedicated place to do that, like a temple, church, or an altar? Generally speaking, the answer is going to be yes, in some form or another. But think about how a church for one of your gods, how the interior, the normal practices, how that differs from a church for one of your other gods in the pantheon. Even though they're both churches, they could be so different. And that's the kind of world building that we want to promote here. Gods can also be worshipped with holidays that have really weird rituals, such as a rabbit that hides eggs filled with candy. Like, that's pretty strange. Finally, that is going to bring us to step 5, which is, how did the gods interact with one another? And this is a step that I consider optional because chances are kind of good, unless you're focusing a campaign completely on gods and the divine and interaction between gods and mortals, there's a good chance that relationships between gods might not even come into play. But if you want to do it just for the fun of world building, I highly encourage you to do so. Just like in the last step, I'm going to ask you a set of questions just to get you thinking a little bit about this and how you want your gods to interact, if they do at all. They could be their own completely separate entities existing in demiplanes far beyond the mortal realm. So firstly, are your gods related at all? In a lot of mythologies, the pantheon is really more of a dysfunctional family tree. There's brothers, sisters, cousins, everything in a very complex web. You don't need to get quite as deep. You're not gonna have Zeus going around getting real busy. But it is good to think about whether there's a familial relation between the gods, or if they're not even family, what is that relationship? Maybe they're friends or enemies, or I don't know, something other than that. Another question is to think about what has happened in the past that defines the dynamics of the relationship between these gods. You know, do they get along? Are they at war? Or where do they reside? So step 6 is, if you want your pantheon to really feel fleshed out, is to treat your gods like NPCs. And I have a video where I walk you through 4 steps to making incredible NPCs every single time. You can find it here, or there's also a link in the description. So be sure to grab your PDF template in the description. It's completely free. Yes, you have to sign up for the email list, but you can always unsubscribe immediately if you're just so upset with me. And if you want tons of free content for your 5e games, head on over to patreon.com/TheAlpineDM and check it out.